The text are written by James Joyce. Her name spans the lips at moments in strange prayers and praises, which I myself did not understand. My eyes were often full of tears, I could not tell why. And at times the heart from my heart seemed to pour itself out into my bosom. I thought this was the future. I did not know whether I would ever speak to her or not. Or if I spoke to her, how could I tell her of my complete adoration? No frequent streets being mine, but the quiet street except at the hour when the Christian Brothers School set the boys part free, and uninhabited house of the two-story student with line A and has from its neighbors in a square round. The other houses of the street conscious of decent lives. Within them, gaze at one another with rounding terminal faces before a tenant of a house or priest that died in the back drawing room. Air musty from having been long enclosed, harming all the rooms and the west room behind the kitchen toilet. Littered with volumes, newspapers, and on this I found a few paper-covered books, the pages of which were closed and damp. The Apple by Moses Ford, the Divine Communicant, and the Memories of Enoch. I like the last best because its lips were yellow. The white garden behind the house contained a central apple tree, and a few straggling bushes, under one of which I found the late tenant's rusty bicycle pump. He had been a very charitable priest. In his will, he had left all his money to institutions and the furniture of his house to his sister. When the short days of winter came last February, before we had all eaten our dinners, when we met in the street, the houses had grown somber. The space of sky above us was the color of ever-changing violet, and to us the lamps of the street lifted their feeble lanterns. The corridors, summers, angry painted our bodies glowed. Our shouts echoed in the silent street. The courier of our play brought us through the dark, muddy lanes behind the houses, where we ran the gauntlet of the rough drive from the cottages to the back doors of the dark, dripping gardens where odors arose from their feet. To the dark odorous stables where scorched melody is put them commonly halls, or short music from the buckled harness. When we returned to the street, light from the kitchen windows had filled the areas. If my uncle was seen turning the corner, we hid in the shadow until he had seen him safely housed. Or if Brandon's sister came out on the doorstep to call her brother into her tea. We watched her from our shadow peer up and down the street. We waited to see whether she would remain or go in, and if she remained, we left her shadow and walked up to Madeleine's sisters. Resignedly, she was waiting for her figure defined by the light from the half-open door. Her brother always teased her before he obeyed, and stood by the railings looking at her. Her dress swung as she moved her body, and the soft robe of her hair tossed from side to side. Every morning I lay on the floor in the front parlor watching her doll. The blind was pulled down to within an inch of the sash, so that I could not be seen. When she came out on the doorstep, my heart leaped. I ran to the hall, seized my books, and followed her. I kept her brown figure always in my eye, and when we came near the point at which our ways diverged, I quickened my pace and passed her. This happened morning after morning. I had never spoken to her except for a few casual words, and yet her name was like a summons to all my foolish thought. Her image accompanied even in places the boat was tied to romance. On Saturday evenings when my aunt went marketing, I had to go to carry some of the parcels. We walked through the flaring streets, jostled by drunken men and bargaining women, and in the causes of laborers, the shrill litanies of shop boys who stood on guard by the barrels of pigs, chicks, the needles chanting, of street singers who sang a come all you were about Donovan Rosa ballad about the troubles in our native land. His voice conversed in a single sensation like me. I imagined that, and all my chance sympathies form of pose, but my body was like a harp, and her words and gestures were like fingers running upon the wires. One evening I went into the back drawing room in which the priest had died. It was a dark, rainy evening, and there was no sound in the house, though one of the broken pans I heard the raining things upon the earth, the fine incessant billows of water playing the sodden beds. Some distant lamp of lighted window gleamed below me. I was thankful that I could see so little. All my senses seemed to desire to bathe themselves, and feeling that I was about to slip on them, I pressed the palms of my hands together until the trembled tongue murmured, "Oh love," many times. At last she spoke to me. When she addressed the first words to me, I was so confused that I did not know what to answer. She asked me, was I going to army? I thought that I answered yes or no. It would be a splendid bazaar. She said she would love to go, and why can't you? I asked. While she spoke, she turned a silver bracelet around and round her wrist. She could not go, she said, because there would be a duty that within her convent, her brother and two other boys were fighting for their caps, and I was alert at the railings. She held up the spikes, bowing her head towards me. The light from the land opposite her door caught the white curve of her neck. This of her hair that wrestled there, and falling, lit up the hand upon the railing. It fell over one side of her dress and caught the white border of a apron, just visible as she stood at ease. "It's well for you," she said. "If I go," I said, "I'll bring you something." What innumerable follies laid waste my waking and sleeping thoughts up to that evening. I wished to annihilate the tedious interval days and chat against the work of school, at night in my bedroom, and by day in the classroom. Her image came between me and the page I dropped to read. The syllables were airy, were cold to me through the silence in which my soul luxuriated and cast an instant enchantment over me. I asked leave to go to the bazaar on Saturday. My aunt was surprised and hoped it was not so premeditated affair. I asked a few questions in class. I watched my master's face pass from middle to his turns. He stopped. He hoped I was not beginning to idle. I could not hold my wandering thoughts together. I had heard the impatience with the serious work of life, which now as it stood between me and my desire, seemed to me child's play. Every monotonous child's play. On Saturday morning, I reminded my uncle that I wished to go to the bazaar and leave him. He was passing at the hotel, looking to act fresh, and answered me hurriedly, "Yes, Paul, I know." As I was in the hall, I did not go into the front hall and library window. I carried the house in like humor and walked slowly towards the school. The air was pitilessly raw, and always in my heart misled me. And when I came home to dinner, my uncle had not yet been home. Still it was early. I sat staring at the clock for some time, and when his ticking began to irritate me, I left the room. I mounted the staircase and gained the upper part of the house. The high, golden, gloomy rooms liberated me, and I went from room to room singing. From the front window, I saw my companions playing below the street. Their cries reached me, liquid and distinct, and leaning my forehead against the cool glass, and looked toward the dark house where she lived. I may have stood there for an hour, saying nothing but the brown-haired figure cast by my imagination. Touched discreetly by the lamplight, the coordinated the hand upon the railings and at the border below the fence. When I came downstairs again, I found Mrs. Moses in a big pie. She was an old garrulous woman in poor brokers who collected some cents for some purpose. I had to deal the gossip of the tea table. The meal was prolonged beyond an hour, and still my uncle did not come. Mrs. Moses stood up to go. She was sorry she couldn't wait any longer, that she was off to get Mr. Clark, and she did not like to be out late. As the night air was bad for her when she had gone, I began to walk up and down the room. Glancing in my face, my aunt said, "I'm afraid you need who's of your myself who is nice of what Lord at 9 o'clock I had my uncle's lips. He in the hall door. I heard him talking to himself and hardly Holstein rocking Winter received the weight of his pretty overcoat. I could interpret the signs when he was midway through his dinner. I asked him to go to give me the money to go to the bazaar. He had forgotten. The people of me begged after the first week, no, she said. I did not smile. My aunt said to him energetically, can't you give him the money and let him go? He kept him less now as it is. My uncle said he was very sorry. He had forgotten. He said he believed in the old saying, one worker no friend makes Jack a dull boy. He asked me where he was going to. And when I told him the second time, he asked me, did I know that you're a hero to Steve? When I left the kitchen, he was about to recite the opening lines of the things to my aunt. I held the program tight in my hand as he strode down Buckingham Street towards the station. The sight of the street thronged with buyers and daily with guests reported me the purposes of my journey. I took my seat in the third class carriage of a deserted train. After an intolerable delay, the train moved out of the station slowly. It kept onward around ruinous houses and over the twinkling river. At Westland Road station, a crowd of people pressed to the carriage doors, but the porters moved them back, saying that it was a special train to the bazaar. I remained alone in their carriage. In a few minutes, the train drove on. Beside an impoverished wooden platform, I passed out onto the road and saw by the lighted dial of the clock that it was 10 minutes to 10. In front of me was a large building which displayed the radical name. I could not find any six-penny entrance, and fearing that the bazaar would be my host, I passed him into a turnstile, handing a shilling to a weary man. I found myself in a big hall, girded and half his height by a gallery. Nearby all the stalls of plates, and the greater part of the hall was in darkness. I recognized the silence like that, which pervades the structure surface. I walked into the center of the bazaar, attending people were gathered for the stalls which were still open. Before a curtain over which the words Catholic chantants were written in colored lamps, two men were counting money on a slumber. I listened to the call of the poets, even when with difficulty where they come. I went to one of the stalls and examined porcelain vases and flower tea sets. At the door of the stall, a young man was talking and laughing with two young gentlemen. I remember their English accents and listened vaguely to their conversation. Oh, I never said such a thing. Oh, but you did. Oh, but I didn't she say that? Yes, I heard her. Oh, there's a few observing me. The young lady came over and asked me, didn't wish to buy anything. The tone of the voice was not encouraging. She seems to have spoken to me out of the sense of duty. And you tell me great jars that stood like distant birds on either side of the dark entrance to the smaller mouth. No, thank you. The young lady changed the position of one of the vases and went at the two young men. They began to talk to the same subject. Once twice the young lady glanced at me over her shoulder and lingered before us all, though I knew my stay was useless to make one just in her warehouse. Something more real. I turned away slowly and walked down the middle of the bazaar. I allowed the few pennies to fall against the sixpence in my pocket. I heard a voice call from one end of the gallery that the light was out. The upper part of the hall was now completely dark. Gazing out into the darkness, I saw Mr. Creature, driven and derided by vanity. My eyes burned with anguish and anger.